Join me, 48 Hours correspondent Erin Moriarty, on my podcast, My Life of Crime, as I take on true crime investigations like no other. This season, I'm looking into the labyrinth of crime and secrets within families. I'm cutting straight to the evidence and talking to the people directly involved, including investigators and the families of victims. Listen to My Life of Crime with Erin Moriarty wherever you get your podcasts.
Girl, real talk. This whole "it's a new year, time to reinvent myself" trash is not the vibe for 2024. You can find someone who loves you for you, as you are. You don't need to read a stack of self-help books, only eat sad salads, or start meditating at 5 a.m. to be ready for dating. So yeah, my advice is to download Bumble and find someone who embraces you the way you are right now. Let me know how it goes.
A note to listeners, the following podcast contains content that may not be suitable for all audiences. Discretion is advised.
I have chronic PTSD from my father's arrest. Having a regular day job for me isn't necessarily ideal. I love writing. My dad's murder spanned from 1974 to 1991. They were looking for him for 31 years. So 2004, they had assumed a long time ago that he was dead or in jail, but it was the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders, the family of 4 out of 7 that he murdered in January of 74. So my dad said that he watched the 30th anniversary on TV. My mom and my brother remember him watching it and him acting a little funny. And within 2 months, he decided to start communicating again with the Wichita police.
You are listening to Partners in True Crime. We are your hosts, Rob and Cindy Dorfman.
Welcome back to the Killing Hour with Doc Bonn. How well do we really know anyone in our lives? Your colleagues at work, your friends, your family? How about your parents? What if you went through your whole life from childhood to being an adult, not really knowing who or what type of person your own father really was?
Kerri Rawson, the daughter of Dennis Rader, found out in 2005, in her mid-20s, that the father who she loved and who raised her was the BTK killer.
From that point on, Kerri's life was shattered. How do you come to terms with the fact that the father who, by her own admission, was a loving, caring husband and father, who was a Boy Scout leader, president of his church, and was proud to walk Kerri down the aisle on her wedding day, was actually a murderer who was killing innocent people for over 30 years?
It's an incredible story that is both sad and horrific, but Kerri Rawson, who has survived it all, is here today to talk with Doc Bonn and us about what it's like living with the sins of her father. This is part 1 of a 2-hour interview she had with us. Without further ado, it's time to start the Killing Hour with Doc Bonn. Well, great. Well, listen, thank you for coming on, and we really appreciate you coming on. And Scott and us have teamed up not just to talk about your father, but other serial killers and trying to understand what's going on. I mean, I don't know if Scott told you anything about us or Doug told you about us, if you've done any research on us. You know, we've been doing this kind of work for a long time now on both sides of the spectrum, everything that revolves around true crime, as far as doing wrongful convictions to helping families with investigations on murder cases, and also trying to understand why some of this stuff happens. So we feel really blessed to have someone like yourself on here who can kind of really experience what it must have been like. And Cindy and I had a similar experience with this with a friend of ours, someone that worked for us, whose uncle was Gary Ridgway. And she wanted to do a documentary on it to try to figure out and understand why their family never really could see the warning signs and see what happened, and how he was able to do this for almost 30 years and underneath their nose and be that dual personality of a loving uncle and then having to do some of the things he did when he was taking people's lives. So we really appreciate you giving us a window into this. We're familiar with it. So we just wanted to talk to you a little bit about it and kind of start off with a general question that I'm sure you've been asked numerous times. What has it been like to be a child of a serial killer?
It depends on what day you're asking. I mean, so it's been, what's the math? It's been 17 years since he was arrested. So like day to day, this far out, I'm primarily a mom of a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old. And now I'm a writer, which I basically fell in love with, and it's really helped me deal with some of the stuff that I couldn't really track down in trauma therapy. I've been in and out of trauma therapy since 2007. I really love writing, and it gives me a job, and it's a job I can do at home. I have chronic PTSD from my father's arrest. Having a regular day job for me isn't necessarily ideal. I love writing, but so day to day, I try to stay in my lane as like mom and writer, and sometimes speaker, or I'll do podcasts, I'll do criminology lectures for colleges, done a couple for high school. I've done Crime Con. I've done a lot of media. I didn't really expect any of that to come from this life, the writing, the speaking, finding out I could help people, educate, train future criminologists. All of that is insane to me that's come out of this, all these positive things. Then on the other hand, for example, this last Monday, another aspect of being his daughter, I get on Instagram, some guy is saying hi. Unfortunately, I went over to the guy's Instagram. He had collectible masks that my dad used in his last crime with Davis on Etsy because of Mindhunter. I can't handle Mindhunter, so I've only seen a little bit of clips, but there's these whole scenes with masks. I don't know if Scott's familiar with it. So on Etsy, somebody's making replica masks, even down to the same color pink strand on them from the Davis murder. People are buying these. Somebody's making a lot of money off these masks. So I inadvertently on a Monday end up on this guy's Instagram and run into my dad's murder mask. So I end up having to block him on all my social media, call a Wichita detective, come to find out he had a YouTube where the FBI had just gone to check on him and was talking to him about my dad. So I don't know anything about this is just going on right now. I'm talking 17 years ago, my father was arrested, and I deal with this now of having to call investigators, and whatever's going on with this guy is probably never going to get back to me, because usually I just hand it to somebody and they deal with it, because they're not going to put it back on me unless they need to ask me something. But this happens occasionally. I try, I could be dealing with this every day, between emails, social media, private messaging. So I usually just save everything. And then if it gets to be to this level, then I'll send it on to an investigator. But normally I don't, because it would be my everyday doing this.
And you want to give energy to it.
No, you don't. But unfortunately, that's my reality of trying to be on Instagram and running into these memorabilia collectors that have the happy face killer art on their wall next to my dad's mask. I don't know if you had heard in the news, but back in the spring of 21, so my dad likes to stalk people. That's one of his things, one of his ways he gets off. He did in between murders. It's one of the things that kept him from murdering so many is just funneling that into stalking. Anyway, he's been doing that from jail. And he's got people to cyber stalk me through social media and my email, contacting me on behalf of my father, saying, hey, we're writing your father. We're on the phone with your father. He's this great guy. I don't know what your deal is. Why aren't you writing him? Why haven't you visited him? Why aren't you calling him? And then they send my social media posts, and they used to send pictures of my kids before we removed them from social media to my dad. And my dad's not allowed my books. People have piecemealed my book to my dad and snuck it in through the prison mail system. And then they were sending front pages of my book to my dad to have him autograph, and then they sell those with my dad's infamous BTK signature. So back in the spring of 21, the cyber stalking got to the point where somebody actually knew I had moved to the Orlando area and was trying to contact me on behalf of my father. Literally, he watched me on a podcast, say like yours, called my father that day or the next day, said, I watched her on this podcast on the anniversary. Basically, it was a podcast on the anniversary of my dad's arrest. I know where she lives. And so that was it. I said, I'm done. And so we got Kansas Department of Corrections involved, victim services involved, law enforcement involved, and I had to cut my dad off legally. So this was in March of 2019. So I cut him off the day before his birthday in March of 2019. And before that, we had done letters, but after that, I was like, I'm done. I'm done, Dad. I'm sorry. I can't do this anymore. I tried really hard for, I don't even know how many years, 15 years, 16 years. So I legally had to cut the man off. So I know from an old news article, Scott has wrote my dad. So legally, if Scott's still in contact with my dad, Scott can't go back and tell my dad he's talked to me. that would be violating like my protection order.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or my dad can't say, hey, Scott, how's my daughter doing? Or where does my daughter live? So going forward, I did share about that at CrimeCon, and there was a news article about it. But going forward, as I do these things, I am occasionally in contact with criminologists that do contact my father. Like I know Scott was saying he played chess with my dad. Dr. Ramsland did too. So where I used to have like close contact with Ramsland, I'm not super comfortable with that anymore, you know? So that's a newer reality I've had to get to just since I've become known like as an author and a speaker.
Well, can I ask you one question about that? How has that been for you? It seems like, does that help you process this by going to the CrimeCon and talking to criminologists and kind of and doing your books? Is that provided any form of therapeutic, cathartic effort for you, resolve for you by doing that?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't something I expected. So from 2005, after his arrest in February of 2005 till 2007, I was dealing with PTSD and I didn't realize it. I was kind of stuck flashing back to those first few hours of finding out who he was and the FBI notifying me. And it was running through my head like a movie reel for like 2 years. I thought I was going insane. I didn't tell anybody. I finally got to trauma therapy and she basically pulled out the DSM and she read PTSD to me. She's like, you're not going insane, you have PTSD. So because I didn't have anything physically traumatic happen to me, I didn't think I qualified as like a trauma victim, but I thought my mother and my grandmother and my family were in great harm based on like the terrible way they notified me. And I thought I was in harm. I literally went into shock when he notified me and I was shaking for like 5 days with no medical care. So I am pretty messed up from that.
How old were you when that happened?
26. Yeah, I was 26. I was in Michigan, thankfully not in Wichita. I had been in Michigan for 18 months, just married. We went to Kansas State, got married in 2003, and then moved to outside of Detroit. So they coordinated the notifications. So arrested my father around the corner from my house, notified my mom, notified me, and notified my brother who was in the Navy in Groton, Connecticut at a submarine base, all at the same time.
Kerri, I have a question about that. You know, that period there where he was apprehended. My understanding is that it was after a DNA match, you know, with you, familial DNA, that he was then arrested. Can you tell us about that process? You know, how that happened?
Yeah, let me go back and finish the other question. So after I got into therapy in 2007, we dealt with like the initial PTSD and got that under control. But then I didn't go back to therapy again until after I started speaking up in the Wichita Eagle, which was in the fall of 2014. I had just had enough. Stephen King had used my parents to make a short story and a movie called The Good Marriage and I found out in the fall of 14, it basically blew up in the media. It became international news overnight. But that was when I started, I had for 9 years, I had felt like I needed to be in hiding. I couldn't talk about it. No one could know who I was. And I had finally started telling some friends in Michigan and people at church, and I had shared my story a few times at church. But I just basically did the wrong thing by blowing up in the media. But being able to talk to like crime journalists, I got to talk to a detective that day, Kelly Otis, who had been instrumental in arresting my father. Speaking up really quickly was like healing on light speed all of a sudden. Like it was like somebody finally, that journalist that called me finally was like he had given me permission to talk. You know, the therapist had in these safe environments, you know, or I had the safe environment of church. But it was all of a sudden now I could actually talk to people that you could talk full details of the crimes. Because I know every detail of the cases. Like I can do criminology lectures down on MOs and everything. I don't choose to, but I can if I need to. So finding people like detectives and journalists that can deal, because there's people that can't deal. There's like, I'm not normal, right? So it's not, I can't talk about some of this stuff in my church group, right? Like they tell me to be quieter and that I'm giving them nightmares. So you have to find people like you guys so that you can talk. So eventually writing, speaking, going to CrimeCon, it's like you get to hang out with a bunch of people that are like, oh, wow, you look like BTK, or you're like, whoa, you're his daughter. And they want to sit down and they want to talk to you and they don't freak out, you know? So all these things I was scared of for almost a decade. Now I've learned to embrace, as these people have embraced me mainly. I mean, like I said, it comes with like that element of art collectors on Instagram on Mondays, but you're going to win some and you're going to lose some. So going back to your DNA question, my dad's murder spanned from 1974 to 1991. They were looking for him for 31 years. So 2004, they had assumed a long time ago that he was dead or in jail, but it was the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders, the family of 4 out of 7 that he murdered in January of 74. So my dad said that he watched the 30th anniversary on TV. My mom and my brother remember him watching it and him acting a little funny. And within 2 months, he decided to start communicating again with the Wichita police. So he sent in driver's license from the 1986 murder that they had not pinned on BTK due to DNA. So back then they told the crime scene investigators in the 70s and the 80s, collect this stuff. Someday we'll be able to test it. We can't even necessarily tell you how or what, but we're being told to save it. So they had saved this evidence back from the 70s and from the 80s. Then once my dad started communicating in 2004, they ran the DNA and realized that BTK had committed the 86 murder, tying it back to the ones from the 70s. So my dad played cat and mouse games, that's a quote from my dad, with the police for almost a year, doing these drops of like letters, tied up dolls, cereal box. It was like being a serial killer joke. Like he even told my mom that, because this was all on the front page news, so they would talk about it at lunch every day. And she'd be like, well, now why is this BTK using a cereal box? And he's like, like serial killer. So anyway, in January of 2005, my dad did a drop at a Home Depot and he left a disc, one of those old hard little 3x5 floppies. Well, that drop actually got lost, but they thought they caught the black Jeep Cherokee on it and they went back. My dad said, did you get that drop? And they're like, no. So they went and traced it down. Luckily, somebody remembered and they found it in the trash. So by now, this is like February that they've found this disc. Well, my dad, the genius, had used the disc at Park City Library, which is where we lived, a suburb of Wichita, and at Christ Lutheran Church, where he was president. So he even asked in like a communication to the Wichita Eagle, which was one of the ways he was communicating to classifieds, can I send in a disc? Is it safe? And of course they told him, yes, of course it's safe. It can't be traced. Well, he used a disc he had used and erased. And so when they got the disc, they pulled his name off of it and the church right away. So this was about a week before he was arrested. They wanted to make sure they had the right guy because they had gotten the wrong guy in December. So they didn't want to screw up again. So they researched my dad. They found the Jeep Cherokee, which was my brother's. My brother was gone to the Navy, in the driveway. So they started surveilling my dad. They wanted to make sure they had him. And somebody with the KBI and the Wichita police, maybe the FBI too, they came up with the idea to get my DNA. So they went to Kansas State, dug through my medical files. They had a subpoena and a warrant. I had no idea. No, I did not know anything. And they claim originally CNN said it was a blood sample that I had turned in, which wasn't true. That's still in the news that I turned my father in through blood. Not true. Out there, mainly people say it's a pap smear. It was actually like a cyst that had been removed from my cervix. I'm pretty sure not the pap smear. So I still don't 100% know about that. Anyway, they found an old slide, took it to the KBI lab in Topeka and extracted the DNA, which I from what I understand was pretty complicated, extracting this DNA in 2005 from a slide from say 2000 or something that was really old. So I matched, one allele was off because of the sample, but of course I matched. That was Thursday night. They gathered everybody together quietly and then arrested him the next day at noon when he was on his way home from work. So I think I'm one of the first ones to have used where they use familiar DNA to catch somebody. I think I might be one of the first cases. I don't know for sure. Don't quote me on that, but I'm like one of the first cases. So the FBI, they sent an agent. It was actually just an accountant, not a criminal guy, out to notify me. And he was sitting in an old car outside my apartment for probably an hour or an hour and a half, waiting to be told for sure they had my dad. And so I was already completely freaked out by this person. I almost called the police on the FBI. Like I had called my husband, Darian, to come home. So I was already pretty messed up by the time this guy wanted to come into my apartment. And like the man literally walked into my kitchen and he's like, have you heard of BTK? And I was like thinking, well, BTK murders women that live alone. So I was like, did something happen to my grandma, my dad's mom, because she lived alone? And he's like, no, your grandma's fine. And then I was like, and I think right then he was like, your dad is BTK. He just dropped it, like, bam. And then I was like, well, is my mom murdered? Because assuming when you've heard for the first time somebody's a murderer in your family, you assume like right then there's been a murderer. Like, because I didn't really know the cases. I didn't know a BTK till 2004, the summer of 04, and I didn't really pay much attention to it. So I didn't even really know the cases. So I'm assuming somebody's been murdered right then, not like 20 years before that. I'm pretty messed up.
Well, I mean, you've been through trauma that's unexplainable. I mean,
and it still goes on. I mean, literally Monday, when I'm looking at replica masks down to the cords, like I called the detective and I'm like, is that the actual mask? So now I'm having to pull up from Google an image of the mask of my dad's trial, the actual mask, saying, my God, how does this man have the actual mask? Because it even had the mud smears on it. And I'm like, how does somebody actually have the actual mask? And then now I'm over here like trying to Google image this stuff, and I'm finding all these on Etsy where there's like 10 different kinds, and somebody's like dirtying up these masks and dirtying up the rope to make it as closest to the one that actually is.
I'm so sorry you have to deal with that now. That's just awful.
Well, and with my kind of trauma, anything unexpected can just whammy me. So I'm not expecting to go over and see a murder mask that my dad wore that placed on Mrs. Davis's body when I was 12 on a Monday. You know what I mean?
Right.
So like, if you warn me, like if I know I'm going to talk for you guys, or I know I'm going to go for a criminology lecture, I'm going to go back in and maybe look at some detailed note, or I'm going to know my audience. Well, so like at CrimeCon, I was speaking with somebody from CNN, and they ran a little clip before I went on stage, and it was like just an actor with like leather gloves. Well, I can't handle men in leather gloves because of my father now. I literally had to like disassociate and disconnect from that visual so I could go on stage and do what I needed to do. So literally, I'm just like a walking PTSD.
Absolutely. I mean, my question for you is, growing up, what was it like with your dad? So did you have any inclination that he had something like this inside of him?
No, I mean, I know people are like, how did you not know? But I mean, if you talk to Ridgway's family or Golden State's family, Golden State's very similar to my father. I mean, their MOs are different, but they both had the ability to stop. They both had children. Golden State had kids living with him, grandkids, I believe. So like Golden State and my father are similar in that they both had the ability to control it and put their energy to other places. And they knew they tried to redirect it. So growing up, I mean, my dad was strict and could be controlling. So in hindsight, we definitely were like verbally and emotionally abused. There was no sexual abuse in my house, but my brother as a young adult was physically abused twice. In 96 and around 2001, my dad tried to strangle him from the front. You know, I mean, that's a high warning sign. I understand now with domestic violence that someone's going to escalate or already has. Back then, we never talked about it after it happened. I mean, we didn't tell anybody. I mean, my dad worked down the hallway from the Park City Police. So what would have happened if we had called the police that night for what my dad did? Obviously, if somebody in your house is strangling somebody, you should call the police. We were so ingrained, it was so abnormal, but it wasn't, because my dad had this temper or this ability to get really verbally violent. I mean, in therapy, I talk about it in my first book, but in 15, I mean, we literally worked on therapy where we shook out of me a memory of my father threatening me, taking off a belt and threatening me like when I was 4. I mean, my dad used a belt to strangle Nancy Fox when my mom was pregnant with me. So, I mean, that really messes you up when you start putting all those pieces together. Like I literally was back in therapy in 15 after talking in 14, and I took Wichita Eagles BTK book in, and we worked basically line by line, because everything can be trauma for me, like ropes, gloves, nails, hardware stuff, any like knives, anything. I mean, so like even in 15 in my house, we were still using the blue and yellow towels that I had in my kitchen in 05 when the FBI agent notified me. And literally in 15, it had been 10 years, and all of a sudden I couldn't handle the towels. Like my husband comes home to a pile of towels. I said, you got to get him out of here. Just like 10 years later. I was alive for 3 of the murders from 85, 86, and 91. So those ones bother me the most. And I've had to work through everything I know from then and I know now. So there weren't, my father was just kind of like, my father calls it cubing, where he's going to show you, okay, my father's a sexual sadistic psychopath or sociopath, like the old terms. What's the newer term?
Is it a malignant narcissist?
Yeah, malignant narcissist or antisocial personality disorder. They're trying to get away from psychopath and sociopath. Mm-hmm. But my father had control over it. So he could show you who he wanted to, and he calls it cubing. So he would flip the cube to show you dad, or show you Dennis Rader, like guy that did communion at church, Dennis Rader neighbor, Dennis Rader compliance officer, Dennis Rader brother. So I saw all those things, especially in hindsight. My father was really big in uniforms. So my father literally would change his clothes to take the trash out, change his clothes to garden. That would be different than his walking the dog. Everything came with like a hat, jacket, sometimes different shoes. We knew my dad was sort of OCD, and we knew my dad sometimes dealt with depression, but you don't go from somebody that has an anger issue, some OCD, some controlling, some verbal, emotional abuse that you've learned to manage and handle from when you were little by like watching your mom. Even what he did to my brother, you don't jump from that to thinking he's BTK when I didn't even know what a BTK was.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was a collector, like many serial killers. He collected his so-called trophies, and he referred to the trophies that he apparently kept at home in a locked box as his mother lode of trophies. Now I've heard that this box was there in the basement or in the home, not in the basement, but that your mother was aware of this box and she was suspicious of it. Oh, that's not true.
No, okay. There's no way. My mother, like, some people have tried to throw my mom under the bus. She was victimized like the rest of us. Mm-hmm. And my dad was a classic narcissist in that he loved my mom constantly, took her to dinner, took her to her favorite movies. He was a better spouse than my spouse in those ways of just loving my mom, taking her to church, cubing into that. But here's the thing about my father. Now, Scott might say my father was incapable of love. Okay. So I'm going to come back and say, no, he literally was my dad, literally was her husband. He literally loved us. It wasn't a role. It wasn't a cover. He just would flip and then flip over to the other guy. So he calls it white hat, black hat. There's quotes out there that dad was 90%, 95% BTK, 5% my dad. I will say it the other way, because if I had met BTK, I wouldn't be alive. There's one person that survived BTK. Okay. Yeah. So we saw flashes of it where his face would change when he got really angry. There was a time he chased me down the hall when I was 16. My mom got in the way because I was going to be a dead person for being a teenager, cussing at my father. You could see, and you saw this change in my father's face when he went after my brother. So in those instances, yes, we were probably getting pretty close to that BTK. But you were asking about his mother-lode collection. We lived in a 3-bedroom ranch, probably about 1,500 square feet. We had 3 bedrooms and a bathroom, and in our hallway there was a tall linen closet with like a big thing for sheets, and then 3 drawers. Bottom of the drawer, early 70s, probably somewhere after Otero's and Bright, which was a couple months after Otero. I don't know, I'd have to look back at the Eagle book or mine, but he hollowed out, the floor was wood, and he hollowed out a space. And he maybe had a box in there, but I don't even know. If it was probably like a cigar box or something. That's where he kept his most important trophies, which were driver's license from the victims, some jewelry, and maybe some lingerie. So that was kept underneath a false floorboard. The night of his arrest, he's playing games with them for hours, denying that he's BTK. And they finally say, like after 6 or 7 hours, look, we're in your home. We can tear it up, which is going to make things worse for Paula and the kids, or you can cooperate and tell us where your evidence is. And so he finally told it, because they wouldn't have necessarily found that under the floorboard. So I never went and looked back for that one. I was only back in my house a couple times to get my stuff out a few months later, but I did actually check my mom's parents because their house was identical. It was 9 houses down from ours. And I did pull out my grandma's drawer and I checked to make sure that he hadn't made a false bottom in her house, and he had not. But I figured that was something my dad would do. He even used like our church for a drop. He used his parents' house like to store stuff and do his Polaroids, his bondage things. So anything like that completely was total BTK evidence. It was hidden in underneath that floorboard. But he did like collect magazines, and he kept things on index cards. Like he would cut out women from magazines. Like I remember there was a stack of index cards from the compliance officer thing, but I know people get upset about that. Like, why didn't we not see these things? And Scott, he could have had some lesser stuff locked in a box in his closet, but you didn't touch dad's stuff. Like as a kid, you would have gotten spanked or grounded. Like so you didn't even go
control freak. A
complete control freak.
Girl, real talk. This whole "it's a new year, time to reinvent myself" trash is not the vibe for 2024. You can find someone who loves you for you, as you are. You don't need to read a stack of self-help books, only eat sad salads, or like start meditating at 5 a.m. to be ready for dating. So yeah, my advice is to download Bumble and find someone who embraces you the way you are right now. Let me know how it goes.
Inspired by the life of the savvy and ambitious Colombian businesswoman Griselda Blanco comes a new Netflix original limited series. Griselda tells the story of a devoted mother who, with her lethal blend of charm and relentless savagery, creates one of the most powerful cartels in history. Witness Sofia Vergara's captivating transformation into the godmother of the underworld. Griselda, streaming January 25th, only on Netflix.
Like he had been in the military, he would still like shine his shoes to go to church on Sundays. And like you had to take a bath on Saturday night. You had to dress up. Some of that was my mom too on Sunday. But like, I mean, from when I was tiny.
Yeah, but those are kind of normal things that people did back then.
But like from when I was tiny, I had a fear of my father more than I would say my children ever have of my husband. I mean,
I think that's a generational thing too. I think,
yeah, that's true. It is very generational.
Because my father had the same thing. You didn't go into his stuff. His nightstand. He used to keep. It wasn't locked, but he kept stuff in his nightstand, and like it was his personal, private things. And if he had and of course, as a curious kid, if I was staying home from school from sick, I would go in there because he told me not to go in there, and I knew that if they found out, that there would be reprisals. So. I wanted to go back a little bit where you were talking about the like your father's like the love part where you're saying that in the cubism, and I saw your wedding video where he was walking you down the aisle, and I think that kind of relates to what you were saying because he definitely looked like a loving father while he was walking you down. There's a close up.
He didn't look. He is.
I'm just saying. I'm just from our perspective. It's like I'm agreeing with you that but I'm just saying that you can't. I don't think you can mask that type thing.
No, and that's what I've argued with. Like Otis will come. Otis gets upset and mad, and be like, Otis was even like a few years ago. He's like, every moment of your life has been a lie. And I was like, thanks, Otis. That's what I really need right now. He was one of the detectives. Because for anybody that has met my father after the arrest, like they see a total jerk off, right? But also that's what my father wants them to see. Okay. And I mean, when you're talking about detectives that have spent their whole career trying to track this guy down that murdered children, I get it. So I'm not ever trying to defend my father, but part of what I'm trying to do when I'm trying to educate, no, I'm not defending this indefensible person in these manners. I'm trying to educate and say, hey, we're not necessarily getting it completely right. Like maybe we're not catching guys like my dad, Ridgway, Golden State. There's got to be others. I mean, now I know things are different because of DNA and, like there's a reason these guys were really prevalent in the 70s or early 80s and you're not seeing these guys or they've gotten better at it.
Yeah, but it's still happening. It's still happening.
Right. It is.
It happened here. They just caught a serial killer here 2 weeks ago.
It's true. But the numbers of active serial killers, as Kerri said, has gone down dramatically since the 70s and 80s. And I attribute a lot of it to, better techniques, a better understanding, and perhaps even catching fledgling serial killers after their first murder before they go on to become serial killers.
And better mental health. I mean, when I was in elementary in the 80s, I mean, I wasn't getting help for my reading issues or dyslexic or writing stuff, and now my kids have massive access to therapies, counselors, and health care too. So like some things like epilepsy can get untreated, even vision, like if you don't get kids' vision corrected, it can lead to learning problems and lead them down these wrong paths. Some of it is that we're like Scott says, we're catching them earlier, or we're helping them earlier, so they're not turning into what my father did, because my father will tell you something was wrong with him when he was a kid. I mean, he basically had what we call nowadays a conduct disorder by the time he was 7 or 8. Now we're trying to catch these kids and get them help, put them in juvie.
What is that? What do you mean? What kind of disorder did he have as a child?
Conduct disorder. I mean, Scott can talk more about that if he wants, but
he told me in his writings that he knew as early as 10 or before 10 that there was something wrong, because he would become literally sexually aroused by scenes of violence when he was tied up as playing cowboys and Indians, that these things would actually arouse him, and he was conscious of the fact that this wasn't quite normal, so right. So I think even early on,
but he claims that. Now, he claims in Ramsland's book, which you have to take with a grain of salt, because of course it's my dad trying to get attention. You got to go into Ramsland's book looking at it as like a keen insight into somebody like my father talking about my father. So some of that with Ramsland you have to watch, because it's my dad pushing it, or my dad has done so much research now that he's been in prison. Sometimes he's pushing in other people's stuff into him. Mm-hmm. But he claims that he was stalking women by the time he was like 8, window peeping, taking lingerie, like the triad. I think maybe like, I don't know if he was doing the fires, but he claims he was killing stray cats, which all of this stuff now, if a kid or a teenager is exhibiting that falls under conduct disorder. Mm-hmm. Like oppositional defiant leads to conduct disorder. If those things aren't treated, they can lead to somebody that's a serial killer. Well, now we're catching those things.
And he was a student of the game, and he studied other serial killers and their developments and their evolution. So it's quite possible that, as you said, that he's just projecting, some of this as well and creating his own mythology.
Possible to say, because he's a narcissistic, pathological liar. So everything he says, it's hard for me to say, okay, everything the man says post arrest, you have to take through the lens of a pathological liar. Okay, well then a detective will come back and say, okay, do we take your life the first 26 years and say everything was pathological lie? No. So that's where I can't function if I've gone back and forth. Dad is BTK. Now I'm able to see them both, but it's taken a lot of work and a lot of therapy, and I tried to hold on to my dad after he was arrested, and I tried really hard. And then it got to the point that it was dangerous. And so I had to cut it. And that's
understandable.
Like, the worst thing you can do to a psychopath or a narcissist is ignore them. So I'm not trying to punish my father. I'm not safe. My children aren't safe.
Yeah, makes sense. A question related to that. So when you talked about other people, him having other people stalk you and himself sending you disturbing things and so forth. I wonder, knowing the way he is and his need to be in control and so forth, I wonder if in some ways, as you became a celebrated author yourself, if he was in some ways jealous of that notoriety.
Yeah, I mean, back in 2014, so him and I were basically battling it out in the Eagle, because I had spoke up. He was getting the newspaper. So he literally was reading in the next day, his daughter on the front page. It's been almost 10 years. He's not news anymore. Stephen King, which was a beloved author of his, and we shared Stephen King growing up. Dad was the cool dad. Okay, you asked earlier what it was like to grow up with dad. On the good, fun side, like Dad let me read whatever I wanted. There was no censor with my father. Like, as soon as I could read Stephen King by 4th or 5th grade, he didn't care. My mom cared, but I just snuck him. Dad and I would go to the library, and he would be like, here's Stephen King, and then we would watch him. So like, he took me to all the great movies. So, I mean, I literally saw Seven with the man like in 95. Okay. So I come out of there, it's dark. And my dad is asking me, how did that make you feel? Like he wanted to experience what it was like for like an innocent person to feel that insanely creepy movie I've only been able to watch once. Like in 19, I'm sitting on Dr. Phil's stage and he's like, you realize your dad was probably getting off next to you in the movie theater while you were watching Seven. And I was like, no, Dr. Phil, I did not realize that. Thank you now for that added new thing I have to go back into therapy for. You know, as I'm being filmed and there's like this audience here and I'm like, great. Thanks.
And he's a doctor.
Yeah. I mean, he was helpful. Like they did this thing where they put pictures of my life above a timeline and then they put BTK pictures below. And he told me to stay above the line, which is something I've had to work on, you know, to be mindful of how many times I talk about this, you know, how many things I take because I can get stuck back in there if I don't self-care between this stuff. But you were saying about my father. So in 14, here's like his beloved author has now modeled a short story on my parents and a movie, making news, talking about my parents. Now here's his daughter, like just running her mouth. So then my dad writes into the Eagle, then that gets published. Then I get interviewed again. And then it was back and forth. The Eagle contacting him, contacting me. They ran this big piece. So in the spring of 15, I get a letter from my dad. And he says, I think I finally understand like what's wrong with the family the last 10 years. Like I'm paraphrasing here, but like why you guys won't come visit or write her too much. Like I understand what I put you through. So it was like, he's like, I shed some tears. So it was like, I literally had got through to my dad for maybe about 5 seconds. But in that same letter, he's back to the narcissistic side, trying to like hold himself over us and threatening us. Like, if you don't write me more, I'm going to give my dead body when I die to some random woman in Arkansas. And that's literally my father in the same letter. So once I started speaking up, I was approached, like, basically the journalist was like, wow, you've given me such good notes. I had given him like 80 pages of notes for a 4,500 piece. He's like, I think you're a writer. I was like, no, I'm not. And he's like, well, I mean, I had gotten like a 5 in AP English in high school, but like I was all in science in college. I didn't know I was a writer. And then I contacted my agent and like in 5 seconds, he signed me. He's like, you have this crazy story. So I was going to co-write. I worked with 2 co-writers within a year. I had bypassed them because there was like this driving need to write. And actually my dad there's a big fancy Latin word in Ramson's book about my father's insane need to write, hieroglyphia or something, hypogryphia. I don't know. Maybe I have that too. I don't know.
Well, you also have a lot inside you. So that's another thing. It's a voice
I mean,
that's constantly playing. It's constantly
like,
playing. You have
that's what trauma feels like in me. And even going into therapy when I was starting writing again, it wasn't enough. So writing was like giving me a safe space to deal with all this, put it somewhere, keep editing it, get better at writing. And it gave me a chance to go back and find my father, like the man I knew that I camped with and hiked with and fished and I loved. My dad was like my best friend. Even though my dad could be a controlling jerk, he was still my best friend. Writing gave me that ability, a safe place to get all of that out. And then it became this thing that helps thousands of people, which is awesome.
Yeah.
So yeah, my dad was contacting me in like 16 through letters, like Scott was asking, saying, well, can we maybe do a chap art book? You know, because I had to get my dad's permission to put his letters in my book, you know, and so he was willing to help me, but he was wanting to insert himself back in. Like in 15, he was like, I want you to read these books about serial killers because I think you can maybe actually help me figure out what's wrong with me, you know. So on one end, he does actually want to know what's wrong with him. And he does want to be that good guy with the white hat to help educate, but it always goes back to him, always.
Absolutely. And when I first wrote to him, which was in 2010, at that time, I was a full-time tenured college professor, and he jumped on that immediately. You know, the fact that a college professor would come to him, you know, for instruction was just, you know, he ate that up like catnip, which I suspected, knowing his personality. But I have a question for you that he needs to be always in control of the narrative, and he
not just the narrative, the environment. He has to control his environment, which is what he did in my house.
Makes perfect sense. And so when I pushed him on culpability, he had an interesting response. He said, how dare you or society judge me when God made me a natural born predator.
No.
And that was his comeback. So,
oh God.
So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, there's the nature nurture debate, right? Like, are these guys born messed up, missing? I call it that line, that moral line we have. Like, we all have different ones, right? Like, I'm uncomfortable driving by a police officer thinking I'm doing something wrong. I've never even had a speeding ticket. That's where my moral line is, because I'm weird like that. Okay. I'm like the best behaved person you're ever going to meet. So where's my dad's line? Because my dad even has a line, because he would tell you, well, I don't rape. That's like my dad's line. Like, he immature masturbates on once his victims are dead on the women or near the little boy. So it's an immaturity thing there partly. But my dad would be repulsed by, say, Golden State. Okay. Like, he doesn't like violence. There was one incident with a knife because he had to end it quickly. My dad prefers nice and neat strangulation. Again, he likes to be in control. The second case was not in control. He lost full control over it. Nurture and nature, okay? But then my dad has 3 younger brothers and they turned out fine, okay? The youngest had a few issues, but nothing like my dad. So explain that. Like, they were raised in the same house by the same parents.
It's rather self-serving of him to say that, isn't it? That God made him that way, because that means he's not responsible, right?
Right, he's not, well, the narcissist, he's not being a psychopath, he's not going to take personal responsibility. Like, he does not want to take personal responsibility for what he did. And when he had the opportunity to apologize in August of 2005, he made it all about him. And it's called the Golden Globes, where he's thanking everybody, like the detectives in the Wichita Eagle and the court. And it's really bad. Right after the families had spent like a day telling him what he had taken from them. And he's sitting there like thanking everybody. And then he says something like that, me and my brother and my mom were pawns in his game and he used us. So when I heard that, I shut down and didn't contact him for 2 years. Then I did therapy. I contacted him once to tell him I was pregnant. Then I couldn't handle it, thinking my mom pregnant, what happened to Nancy Fox. Shut down for another 5 years, just very protective, like, I'm going to become a mom. Then I ended up finally forgiving him, and I contacted him, and then we were doing better for like 5 years. And then my last letter to him was in the fall of 17. And then I cut him off in the spring of 21. But you were asking about him sending stuff. He's really well known for these really crazy drawings in prison. I have a bunch of them, like gaping, open mouth, like fish. Like, he's Pisces, that's his zodiac sign. So he's really obsessed. He calls himself the Kansas Pisces since he was in prison. He doesn't like calling himself BTK. To me, he's never once mentioned BTK to me, never once mentioned the crimes, but he likes to still send me like these drawings of the Kansas Pisces, or from his cave, like that's what he calls his solitary jail cell, his cave, El Calvra. He has drawings around it. One thing I noticed now that I know him well, sometimes even people send me things, like the media or somebody will send me something to authenticate and be like, is this really your father's drawing? And I usually know it like within seconds. So one of the things is he sent me a Christmas card and it's got garland like going like this, like garland would. So it takes me like, good God, probably 6 or 7 years. And I'm back looking at that. And I'm like, oh, that's an upside down bee, that he's making his BTK symbol in this Christmas card that he's sending his daughter. And the bees are for boobs. Like, it's a bee. And then there's the T going through the boob with this and then the K. So he just left off the T and the K, and he's literally making that and sending it to me because he's probably enjoying it, right? So when he said that level of like fetish with your daughter, no, I'm done. Yeah. Sorry.
He loves his little games, his little inside games. And you mentioned I got similar drawings, he would call his letters to me missives from Caveland, and there was always a cave at the top of the letter, and it was even seasonally correct, so that there would be birds and flowers in springtime and a snowman, in the winter, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and he was paying training in the jail system with like candy bars and things for people to make him cards and pretty art. But then he also does these insane like animal. I've shared some of them. You can find them on Google, but these gaping animals with the teeth. Like, is he like wanting to devour me? And then you have these women's that are serial killer fans, really well known. It's a really well known phenomenon where these women write people like my father, They get really attached. Some of them go visit.
I, in fact, have a postcard. Have you ever heard the name Dana Sue Gray? Do you know that name?
I'm not sure.
She's a female serial killer in California, and she actually had a crush on your father, and drew a and I have it. It's a hand painted postcard that she sent to him, and expressing her admiration and so forth. And I was regifted this postcard from your father because he said, Who does she think she is? She's not in my league. She only killed 3 people.
So that's the narcissist too. Back to the images real quick. He did a bookplate for Ramsland's book. Okay, so the proceeds of Ramsland's book, she was only allowed to write it with my father because the proceeds go to the victim's fund. He did a bookplate for her, and it took me a little bit again. And all of a sudden, I realized he's got an upside down bondage rack in the middle of the bookplate because his last murder that was supposed to be in the fall of 2004, he wanted to hang her upside down. Like, why is this getting made? Why is this getting out of the jail? And why is this being allowed to be in a criminologist's book? They're all numbered and signed by my father. Now, some of that has been cracked down on since I contacted them in 21, because even people were sending photocopies of crime scene photos, like Josie Otero crime scene photo, to my father in jail that was getting through the mail system, and my father was signing him and mailing him out to make money. My father has a whole black market thing, so he's not allowed to profit son of Sam loss, but if he gifts you something and then you give him money, completely legal. So he has a whole black market racket going on.
Not surprising that he'd find a loophole in the law to take advantage of.
Yeah. I mean, he sold out. You can look on the news. He sent his sweatpants, his shoes, some fillings they removed. That's all been sent out through the mail system at the prison and sold on the black market.
If I could, I'd like to ask you a question about this, the so-called murderabilia, that people collect. And it's not just his stuff. I mean, it's Manson, it's, Bundy. Manson used to get lockets of hair out that people paid thousands of dollars for. So, and you've been absolutely re-victimized, and you described that so eloquently, earlier about, when you have to deal with these situations. What do you make of the mentality? I mean, the individuals who are obsessed, who collect this stuff, who think that they're his friends. I mean, what do you make of the psychology of that?
I mean, somebody like my father, he's using them to get money to buy a candy bar. Like, he's viewing it as a profit system. So even lately, like a few years, 3 or 4 years ago, my dad claimed that he was going to retire. So he came up with this point system, like 1 through 10, and he melded. He somehow, the man does not have access to a computer. He does not have access to a copy machine. But somehow, he makes these things and sends them places, and people will photocopy for him, or somebody does in the prison and then gives it back to him. I mean, he's got a whole racket going on. So he had the sheet and he sent it to me where I needed to score high enough on his point system to be worthy of getting any more letters from my father. Like you were saying, he was willing to talk to you because of your level of education, or because you were willing to play his chess game with him. You gave him something valuable, or something he deemed of value. Like some college girl wrote him recently from Kansas State, and I had gone there. So he wrote her back about me because to him that gave him value to thinking of this young co-ed being like his daughter. What I don't understand is these people don't understand that if he got out, he would murder you, or he would really like to. And he's imagining murdering you in prison and getting off on it. So like, there's a big disconnect there. And then
I think a lot of things, go ahead.
Well, no, that's what I'm saying. Like, why do you think people are so fascinated with him, knowing that he would kill them if he came out?
Well, I mean, I guess I've talked about it before with others. It's like, okay, so you know how we like the monster movies, we like the horror movies. It's like, how close can you get to somebody and not actually be physically in danger? Like, is it like that thrill of watching those movies? So now you're actually getting to talk to somebody like that. Some of it, I think, is just this desire to like be really close to a monster. But I don't know, this desire to collect this art and hang it on walls. I don't know what that is. I don't know if anybody really does. I mean, because there's true crime fans, there's my kind of work that I'm trying to keep above above the shelf. I'm sure I haven't always, like, you know, I mean, some people would probably question a couple of the documentaries I've been in. I don't have creative control over that kind of stuff with the reenactments, you know. I mean, and there's questions about should somebody like me even be talking? Should somebody like me be writing a book? Should this be my income? I get that all the time. Like, didn't you just give all the money to the victims? And I'm like, I am a victim. Like, this is my job, and I'm helping people. So I don't know what that desire to collect that stuff is, other than maybe just the notoriety, you know, like they think it's cool, or they want to get closer to the.
There's still people who collect Hitler memorabilia, stuff that he had. I mean, it's a weird fetishism that I think that's just like getting close to the tiger's cage, getting close to like a wild animal, you know, without getting bit. You know, it's that adrenaline rush. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, so when you ask her.
I mean, speaking of the victims and everyone, you know, we always want to remember the victims and understand the suffering and the pain that they've endured. And you are correct. You are a victim in this. Okay. And people need to understand that as well, that you did not ask for any of this. No. And now you're trying to turn it into something positive, which is something people should be respectful of. And the fact that you're doing this to help other people who have maybe also been through something as traumatic as this, or who can maybe see the signs and stop it. So have you had any communication with the families of the victims?
No. So back in 2005, we could have gone to my dad's trial. My dad pled guilty. So luckily we were not. The community was not put through a massive trial. So we could have gone, but we were too messed up then and didn't want anything to do with the media. So we just let them have that time. You know, we couldn't have handled it back then. And since then, I mean, my family was dead quiet for almost 10 years. And then since I've been on documentaries where you also see clips with some of the family, but we've never met in person. So we've all just been pretty respectful of each other. Now, I'm sure there was probably some backlash. With a case like my father's, you're talking about 7 families plus mine. So there's 8 families. You're talking about stuff that spans back almost 50 years. Yeah, 50 years now. So, I mean, you're talking about multi-generational like impacts now. So some families, some of my dad's victim families do speak or have in the past, and some don't. So I honestly don't even know who all speaks and who doesn't. I mean, I could have ran into these people before and not realized it, unfortunately, is the reality, because some of them are very quiet, you know, or you're talking about somebody that lost a grandmother or lost a daughter, you know, 30, 40 years ago. How old are they now? You know, or you're talking about a case where somebody's been remarried, you know. So, I mean, I've been presented with the opportunities to meet these people, but it's never necessarily been presented to me in a tasteful, productive way that's not going to end up with everybody just sobbing, you know. I mean, I was offered the chance to go film in the Otero house with some of the Otero survivors. And I was like, no, absolutely not. No way. Like, go away. That is not ever happening. I'm not putting them through that. I'm not putting myself through that. Are you out of your mind that you would ask us to go? And they knew that there was money on the table, so that some of the victims were willing to do that. And I'm like, no, I'm not doing it. And when I said no, it fell through. And that's also the reality, that unfortunately, it's almost like if Kerri doesn't do it, then stuff falls through for these families. And that's really messed up.
That what you just described sounds very exploitational, you know.
Right, it was. And I didn't even know. I didn't know that this was something that had been offered to them, and they thought I was on board, and there was even plane tickets booked, is how exploitative it was, that I was being used to that degree. And that was back probably 6 years ago, before I was even published or anything. Yeah. That's how exploitative that was.
Well, when we did Green River Killer, it was a traumatic story because there was hundreds of women that had never been identified. And one of the women who lost her little sister, Jenny Graham, I spent hours talking to her about what had happened to her family. And she originally didn't want to do the show. And I was like, well, that's up to you. I'm not going to pressure you to do something you don't want to do. So, but we continued to talk because I was empathetic to her situation. And I really wanted to help her kind of process what had happened to her. And we built a friendship through that. And then she decided that, you know what, she was like, you know, I'm not going to be afraid to talk about this. I think it is important for me. I have things I want to ask Gary. And I have things I want to ask the family. and I want to do it now. And I was like, that's totally on you. I don't want anything to do with this if you don't want to. And she did. She ended up doing the show, and she confronted Gary's family. They had a very emotional meeting. And then she actually went on to confront Gary. And I think for her, it was a really cathartic experience for her. And she went from being a housewife to getting the confidence through this experience of doing the show with us to going on and running for state representative of Washington State. And that's what she is now. And now she's a victims' rights advocate. And she does so much work to help people through that process, of any kind of crime that's happened to them. But like you, everybody has to find their own way through this pain and trauma and grief. And I think that there's a lot of, unfortunately, media people who take advantage of situations like this, like you're saying, and want to exploit stories just for ratings or whatever. That's not who we are. We don't do stuff like that. And we really do want to help these people go through this process because we see the bigger picture of these are victims. You're a victim. Jenny was a victim. The Ridgeways were victims. The kids, it's not their fault. Their uncle was the Green River Killer. And everybody puts these stigmas on the whole situation and makes all these judgments. And I think what you're doing is really, really important, Kerri.
And powerful.
And I think that it's helping. It will help a lot of people. And I think it's important.
I mean, it has. I mean, I have inboxes full of people, that have criminals in their family, or they need to forgive something, or they're hiding, there's something hidden in their family. Or things, again, talking about generational things. I grew up in the generation, you don't talk about things, you put on that all American family front. I mean, I thought I had the perfect family. I thought we had the perfect life. I believed everything that was presented from my parents, so that's why when somebody like my father had that much control, you didn't even question even when he did outrageous things. But I think for me, we were told early on, like right after his arrest, the FBI was like, don't talk to the media, they'll make it worse. And I'm so naive and innocent. I'm like, what are they going to make worse? But we listen to them because when you're in the middle of some kind of horrible trauma, you literally anchor. So I literally was anchoring to like people that were protecting us, like the police that were out there, the FBI. So we did actually, even if I had issues with them, I was listening to them, and I was listening to the public defenders that were working with my family during my father's case. I think mainly we didn't speak up early, partly out of respect for my mom. Like basically whatever my mom said went with my aunts and my uncles. And honestly, like my dad's family, they're pretty country, they're pretty remote, they're private anyway. You're not going to ever get these people on camera. You're not going to find out where they live. They don't do public life anyway. Like they're like my father is one generation removed from farm people, So I think I was just in that culture in my family, that Midwestern culture. You don't talk about the bad things, you present that you got it together and you're, make pot roast on Sundays. So I wouldn't even have thought to speak up, but I was suffering and I was dying. I literally was dying inside.
Next time on Partners in True Crime.
So you know how many years it's taken me to go back in therapy and writing and go back and figure out what was wrong with me and realize this kid has probably had PTSD since the neighbor lady was murdered by my father when I was 6.
We have an exciting announcement for all of our listeners. Doc Bonn is taking his serial killer expertise on the road this spring in a live theater event.
To purchase tickets to Doc Bonn's show, The Psychology of Serial Killers and Why They Captivate Us, go to www.psychologyofserialkillers.com. That's www.psychologyofserialkillers.com. Go see Doc Bonn and get the real story on what goes on in these notorious killers' minds.
All rights reserved. This has been a production of 722 Media Content.